When Soviet warships failed, they failed in some of the most catastrophic ways in naval history. One battleship capsizes in her own harbor and kills 609 of her own men. Another submarine sits on the ocean floor for 16 hours before anyone even realizes she's missing. Today, we're breaking down the worst peacetime disasters in Soviet naval history, and trust me, these get darker the deeper you go. Let's start with the big one. It's 1:31 in the morning on October 29th, 1955. And the battleship Novorossiysk is sitting quietly at buoy number 3 in Sevastopol's northern bay. She's the flagship of the entire Black Sea Fleet, so this isn't just any ship. Roughly 1,500 men are aboard that night, including 200 naval cadets who came on for training. Then the starboard bow just erupts. A hole over 1,600 square feet tears open under the waterline. Steel bent inward by as much as 10 feet, and seawater comes rushing in fast. Within 3 minutes, she is already listing. Now here's what should have happened next. Tugboats get called in almost immediately, and by 2 a.m., they're already dragging her towards shallower water so she can be beached before things get worse. That's the right call. So why does she end up capsizing anyway? Stick with me, because this is where it gets hard to watch. As the list keeps growing, a junior admiral pushes to get the roughly 800 sailors standing around on deck off the ship. Guys who aren't even part of the damage control effort. The fleet's commander-in-chief, a man named Parkhomenko, says no. He's convinced the ship can still be saved. Here's the number that matters. Naval architects consider 20 degrees of list the point of no return for a hull like this one. By 3:50 a.m., she's already past 10 degrees. 10 minutes later, she's at 17, the admiral asks again. Parkhomenko refuses again. 20 minutes after that, with over 7,700 tons of seawater sitting inside her, Novorossiysk crosses that fatal 20-degree line, sways once toward starboard, then rolls violently to port and goes under in minutes. Hundreds of men jump into freezing water as the hull rolls beneath them. Hundreds more get trapped inside as she settles upside down on the harbor floor. And this next part still gives people chills. For up to 2 days afterward, rescuers report hearing faint tapping sounds coming from somewhere deep inside the wreck. Only 9 men ever get pulled out alive. 609 sailors don't make it, making this the worst peacetime disaster in Soviet naval history. It gets one more twist, though. The Soviet government actually nominates over 600 of these sailors and rescuers for medals of honor. Those medals never get handed out. Decades later, researchers find a note buried in the paperwork saying the fleet commander didn't think it was worth moving forward with. It isn't until 1996, 5 years after the Soviet Union itself is gone, that Russia finally gives those men the recognition they earned. Here's a question you're probably already asking. How does a Soviet flagship end up sinking in her own harbor with no enemy anywhere near her? And to answer that, we've got to go back decades because Novorossiysk wasn't even Soviet to begin with. She started life in Italy in 1911 as the Giulio Cesare, armed with 13 12-inch guns spread across 5 turrets. She barely fired a shot in the First World War, spent most of her career as a training vessel, and by the late 1920s, the Italians had already written her off as obsolete. That should have been the end of the story right there. But Mussolini wanted a bigger fleet without technically breaking the naval treaties that were limiting him, so he found a loophole and rebuilt her almost from scratch between 1933 and 1937. New superstructure, thicker armor, faster engines, pushing her past 27 knots. She came back out a completely different ship, fast enough and modern enough to actually fight, and fight she did. She traded fire with the Royal Navy at the Battle of Calabria in July 1940, and a single shell from HMS Warspite hit her from 24,000 meters away, one of the longest confirmed battleship hits in naval history. She survived it, dodged disaster again during the British raid on Taranto that wrecked half the Italian fleet around her, and kept serving right up until Italy surrendered in 1943. That surrender is what sealed her fate. She survived a German air attack and an attempted mutiny from crew still loyal to Mussolini, then got interned by the Allies. When the war finally ended, the victors carved up the Italian fleet like spoils. And in 1947, a random drawing decided who got what. The Soviet Union pulled the winning ticket. An Italian commander named Prince Giunio Valerio Borghese was furious about the whole arrangement. And we'll come back to him later because he's about to matter a lot more than you'd think. Some Italian sailors even tried to sabotage the ship before the handover. None of it worked. In February 1949, she got renamed Novorossiysk and sailed into Sevastopol under a Soviet flag. But here's the problem: nobody wanted to say out loud, she wasn't ready. Soviet crews were working panels labeled entirely in Italian, and underneath a fresh coat of gray paint, she was aging badly. Between 1949 and 1955, the Soviets pushed through 8 separate refits on a hull already over 40 years old, tearing out her Italian turbines for Soviet-made ones, bolting on new radar, swapping her guns. And here's the thing about refits like that: every single one adds weight to a hull that was never built to carry it. Everyone chips away a little more at her stability. Nobody wanted to hear that, though, because by 1955, she wasn't just an old battleship anymore. She was the flagship, and the flagship isn't supposed to be the problem. So, what actually blew that hole through her hull? Moscow sent in a government commission led by an engineer named Vyacheslav Malyshev. And here's a strange detail: this same man had personally reviewed the Giulio Cesare's blueprints back in 1946 and warned against the Soviets even taking her in the first place. The commission worked fast, wrapping up the whole investigation in under 3 weeks, and their official conclusion was an underwater explosion equal to somewhere between 2,200 and 2,600 pounds of TNT. Their suspect? A leftover German naval mine still sitting on the harbor floor a full decade after the war ended. Sounds tidy, right? But does it actually hold up when you dig into it? German mines only had a battery life of about 7 years, 9 at the absolute outside limit. Novorossiysk sank more than 10 years after the war ended, which means that battery should have been completely dead. And this exact mooring spot had already been used over 130 times by other ships without a single incident, including 10 previous visits from Novorossiysk herself. So why would a mine wait until this one specific night to finally go off? German mines were also built to trigger either instantly or after a 6-hour delay, but this ship had been sitting on that buoy for around 9 hours, matching neither pattern. When the wreck finally got raised in 1957, investigators couldn't find a single fragment of mine casing or detonator anywhere in the wreckage. That's exactly when the alternative theories start creeping in. And remember Prince Borghese from a minute ago? Here's where he comes back. His commando unit had once snuck into Alexandria Harbor during the war and crippled 2 British battleships using nothing but limpet mines. So the theory claims his old frogmen came back years later to settle the score over losing the Giulio Cesare. Divers actually found a second mine attached to a nearby buoy the very next morning, rigged to another former Italian ship and timed to detonate on a Soviet national holiday. And get this, Sevastopol's entire harbor defense network, the torpedo nets, the listening stations, the patrol boats, all happened to be down that exact night too. There's an even darker theory that it never made it into any official report that this was sabotage from inside the Soviet system itself. The head of the Soviet Navy wanted like a fleet built around battleships and cruisers, and Nikita Khrushchev wanted the opposite: submarines and missiles instead of aging gun platforms like Novorossiysk. On the night of the explosion, the Navy chief happened to be recovering from a heart attack far away from the fleet, leaving a deputy who was much more aligned with Khrushchev's thinking in charge of the entire Navy. Within months, the Navy chief got fired, blamed for a disaster he wasn't even present for, and the Soviet Union spent the following years scrapping its old battleships in favor of submarines. Nobody's ever proven any of these theories, and nobody's fully killed them either. Now let's head underwater, because if you thought the surface fleet had it rough, wait until you hear what happened down there. The Soviet Union's first generation of nuclear submarines, called the November class, were built as Moscow's answer to America's Nautilus. 14 of them got built between 1957 and 1963, and almost every single one has a disaster attached to her name. But one boat manages something almost nobody else does. She nearly kills her own crew twice, a full decade apart. Meet K-8. In October 1960, a ruptured steam turbine nearly triggers a full reactor meltdown from a total loss of coolant. The crew manages to jury-rig an emergency cooling system just in time, but not before radioactive gas spreads through the entire submarine and irradiates several of her men. She survives. She keeps serving for another 10 years. You'd think that would be the end of her story, wouldn't you? It's not. In April 1970, K-8 is taking part in a massive naval exercise when electrical fires break out in two separate compartments at the exact same time. The captain manages to get her to the surface, and most of the crew makes it out alive. That should be where this ends. Instead, command makes a call that changes everything, ordering around half those men back aboard to try and save the vessel and tow her home. A storm rolls in. The damaged boat sinks to the ocean floor, taking 52 crew members and 4 nuclear-tipped torpedoes down with her. But if you want the single most tragic submarine story in Soviet history, that title belongs to K-27. She was built around an experimental liquid metal-cooled reactor, more efficient than the standard design, and she'd already managed to sneak up on the American aircraft carrier USS Randolph during NATO exercises without ever being detected. Impressive stuff. Then on May 24, 1968, her port-side reactor breaks down in the Barents Sea. Even though the crew had already warned command that this exact reactor showed the same warning signs the year before and was never properly retested, those warnings get ignored anyway. The captain, convinced his new reactor design couldn't possibly fail, delays emergency measures for hours and doesn't even tell the rest of his crew about the radiation building around them. All 124 men aboard get irradiated. 5 die within a month. And here's the number that really sticks with people. Over the following decades, more than 30 additional sailors who worked to contain that accident die from the radiation they absorbed trying to save their own submarine. K-27 gets judged too expensive to ever repair, so the Soviets just scuttle her in a bay only 33 meters deep, nowhere close to the 3,000 to 4,000 meters that international safety standards actually require for dumping a wrecked nuclear reactor. If Novorossiysk got buried under Soviet secrecy and K-8 and K-27 stayed hidden inside classified files for decades, Kursk is the one disaster nobody could hide. This one isn't even technically Soviet. It happens in Russia in the year 2000, but it carries the exact same DNA as everything you've heard so far: the overconfidence, the corner cutting, the instinct to hide the truth instead of facing it. On August 12, 2000, the nuclear submarine Kursk joins Russia's first major naval exercise in over a decade. Nobody aboard has any idea it's about to become the deadliest peacetime naval disaster in the country's history. At 11:29 in the morning, seismic stations across northern Europe pick up a small explosion. Nearby ships feel their hulls shudder, and one crew even reports it straight to fleet headquarters. That report gets brushed off. Everyone just assumes it's part of the exercise. 2 minutes and 14 seconds later, a second explosion hits, 250 times more powerful than the first, strong enough to register as far away as Alaska. So what actually happened down there? Investigators later trace it back to a faulty weld on a practice torpedo that let highly concentrated peroxide fuel leak inside the torpedo tube. That leak sets off a violent chemical explosion, instantly killing the torpedo room crew and igniting a fire burning at nearly 2,700 degrees Celsius. 2 minutes later, that fire sets off 5 to 7 live torpedo warheads in a chain reaction, tearing a massive hole clean through the hull and collapsing the first 3 compartments entirely. But 23 sailors survived both blasts, retreating into the tiny 9th compartment at the very back of the boat. They spend hours trapped in total darkness, writing notes by feel because they can't even see the page in front of them. A young officer named Dmitry Kolesnikov writes one note at 1:15 in the afternoon listing every man who made it into the compartment, then a second note 2 hours later admitting their odds sit somewhere between 10 and 20%. When the men try replacing a chemical oxygen cartridge to keep breathable air flowing, someone drops it into oily seawater pooling across the deck. It ignites instantly, and the flash fire burns through what little oxygen is left in seconds. Every single one of the 118 men aboard Kursk dies that day. So why does it take so long for anyone to even notice something's wrong? The Russian Navy doesn't realize there's a problem for over 6 hours, writing off the missed communication check as just another equipment failure. Kursk's emergency rescue buoy, the exact device built to float up and mark her position in a crisis, had actually been deliberately disabled during an earlier mission so it wouldn't reveal the submarine's location to American ships watching the Kosovo War. It takes rescuers 16 hours just to locate the wreck. For days afterward, teams fail again and again to attach diving bells to the escape hatch, held back by outdated equipment and brutal weather, while officials publicly claim the crew is alive and being supplied with air. Britain and Norway offer help almost immediately. Russia turns it all down for 5 straight days while the president stays on vacation at a seaside resort. By the time British and Norwegian divers finally force that escape hatch open, there's nobody left inside to save. 609 dead on Novorossiysk, 52 more on K-8, dozens more over the decades from K-27, 118 more on Kursk. These weren't wartime losses, they were peacetime failures built from cut corners and buried warnings. If you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe because we're just getting started.